I'd like to introduce Jason McGregor. Now, Jason is he's got a lot of hats on this conference. He's convened an excellent conference. I'd like to thank him for that. I'm sure there'll be more of that coming along, but definitely wouldn't be happening without him. He's also talking. He's going to be talking about submarine reconnaissance of the Victorian coast. Jason has a long range of experience in an interesting military history, particularly around Victoria, with his association as the president of the Fort Elizabeth Museum Association, along with all his work in the military. So, thank you, Jason. And the questions will be at the end of the next two sessions. So we'll move on to Katie's talk and then have a combined Q&A. Thank you, Jason.
Thanks, David. Can you hear me? Good. I have a couple of people I'd like to thank for this idea. About 20 years ago at Fort Queenscliff, Major General Mike O'Brien made a presentation about a single submarine that sort of piqued my interest. Mike can't be with us today, and the other person that I wanted to thank was our former Vice President, Mackenzie Gregory, who spent hours with me telling me over and over again the same story. He's unfortunately can't be with us at all, but we'll see how this goes. It's going to do it to me now. Excuse me for a moment.
Example, just two hats.
Yeah, so he's doing this.
Okay. We've talked a bit about the Centaur already. Between 1942 and 1945, 28 German and Japanese submarines operated in Australian waters, sinking 30 ships and gathering intelligence from coastal defences, Allied shipping and naval presence. The most infamous attack was the sinking of the Australian hospital ship Centaur off North Stradbroke Island, claiming 268 lives. The 82nd anniversary of this tragic event is on Wednesday, the 14th. German submarines activity in Australian waters was limited, primarily involving long-range Type 9 U-boats capable of travelling over 10,000 nautical miles without refuelling. After Japan's conquest in Southeast Asia, U-boats used ports like Penang and Batavia to increase operational range in the Indian Ocean. In 1942, the Monsoon Group targeted Allied supply lines between the Middle East, India and Australia. The most notable German submarine, as we've already heard, was U-862, one of 30 Type 9 D2 U-boats. In November 1944, U-862 sailed from Batavia, travelling along Western Australia's coast across the Great Australian Bight through Bass Strait and into the Tasmanian Sea. On Christmas Eve 1944, it sank the American Liberty ship Robert J. Walker, 100 miles north of Gabo Island, New South Wales, with most of the crew surviving. 6 weeks later, on February 6, 1945, U-862 sank the motor vessel Peter Sylvester, 700 miles southwest of Fremantle, marking the final German submarine attack in Australian waters. An unverified post-war story claimed a U-862 briefly went ashore, or crew went ashore in South Australia's Coorong region to search for fresh water. However, despite the probability of such an expedition, there is no evidence to support the claim, but to be fair, why would there be? They wouldn't have left a trace if they were doing their job correctly. U-862 successes include 7 ships sunk, total tonnage of about 42,374 tonnes. After Germany surrendered, U-862 was taken over by Japan at Singapore on 5th of May 1945 and became the Japanese submarine I-502 on the 15th of July 1945. I-502 was scuttled in February 1946. So we'll get into some Japanese submarines. Japanese submarine operations aimed to assess Australian port vulnerabilities and disrupt Allied efforts in the South Pacific. Notable submarines included I-21, which is a B1 class sub, carrying a Yokosuka E-14Y Glenn float plane, which will become significant later on. On February 19, 1942, its float plane reconnoitred Sydney Harbour following earlier sinkings of the British steamer SS Kalingo in 1942 and the American freighter SS Florence in February 1942 off New South Wales. I-22 was a C1 class and was designed for combat and carried a midget submarine. I-27, again another B class, sank the Australian freighter SS Iron Crown in Bass Strait on June 4, 1942, and later patrolled the Indian Ocean and Western Australia. I-29 was a B1 class that conducted reconnaissance to disrupt Allied operations. I'd like to focus this presentation on I-25, and a submarine, and in particular its float plane crew. Many people will know these stories. Several navies experimented with submarine-launched aircraft, but few embraced the practice as wholeheartedly as the Japanese. Throughout the 1920s, several experimental aircraft were developed and submarines modified with watertight compartments to carry them. The Yokosuka E-6Y became the most prevalent. I think, if I do that, there's one. That's the E-6Y was the test plane to start with, and you can see it's quite boxy. That's the technical term. It was the first production aircraft to be assigned to the submarine fleet in 1933. Over the next decade, Japan launched several dozen submarines equipped with aviation facilities, envisaging that their reconnaissance capabilities would be of great benefit during the anticipated war with the United States. The Japanese lacked bases and large numbers of long-range reconnaissance flying boats with which to reliably detect enemy forces, and it was hoped that using submarine-launched aircraft would allow for the inspection of the enemy ports for advanced activity. I-25 did not typically travel in a formal flotilla or fixed group with other submarines off the coast of Australia. In fact, I don't think any of them had much of a formation, although they did work together. Japanese submarine operations were often conducted independently as part of a loosely coordinated mission under the broader command of the Imperial Japanese Navy's 8th Submarine Squadron, or similar units. I-25 was one of 20 B1 class submarines designed for long-range missions and equipped to carry a single Yokosuka E-14Y land float plane for aerial reconnaissance. The Type Bs were powerful submarines with a range of about 26,000 kilometres at 16 knots, making it ideal for extended Pacific operations, and it was superior in some ways to the standard US fleet submarine at the beginning of the war, the American Gato class you can see there, both of which were longer than the current Australian Collins class submarine, although the Collins is much wider and much more comfortable for the crew. With a crew of approximately 94 officers and men, I-25 was built at the Mitsubishi Heavy Industries Yard in Kobe, launched on January 8th, 1940, and commissioned just before Japan's entry into World War II in October 15, 1941. You can see the top right-hand corner, Nobuo Fujita and Shoji Okuda were posing with their Yokosuka E-14Y. The Yokosuka Type O seaplane, which the Allies designated Glenn, is a low-wing metal wood and fabric two-seat monoplane outfitted with a rear-facing 7.7mm machine gun. It was powered by a 9-cylinder, 340 horsepower Hitachi Tempur 12-cylinder radial engine, which will mean something to the buffs, capable of providing a maximum speed of about 150 miles per hour. Although speeds of 85 were more common, it weighed 3,500 pounds, had a wingspan of 36 feet, and was crewed by the pilot and navigator. The plane was carried in sections inside a streamlined steel hangar just ahead of the sub's conning tower, where you can see it's the little bump there. A 7-man crew could assemble its 12 components in about 15 minutes and launch it from a compressed air catapult on the foredeck. Very similar launch to what would happen now in a normal aircraft carrier. The pilots pretty much brace themselves for impact and hope the thing gets airborne. I-25's Glen crew was Petty Officer Soju Okuda and Warrant Flying Officer Nobuo Fujita. They participated in the opening phase of the Pacific War as part of the Japanese submarine force supporting the attack on Pearl Harbor. Positioned off the Hawaiian Islands, it was tasked with patrolling and attacking any American ships attempting to escape or reinforce the naval base. While it did not engage in direct combat during the initial assault, its presence contributed to the broader Japanese effort to isolate Hawaii. Following Pearl Harbor, I-25 was redeployed to the US West Coast to disrupt shipping and gather intelligence. In late December 1941 and early January 1942, it patrolled off Oregon and California, sinking the American tanker SS Montebello in December 23. The tanker, carrying 73,000 barrels of oil, was hit by a torpedo and sank quickly off the California coast near Cambria, though the crew escaped in lifeboats. I-25 sank the Soviet freighter SS Kursk on February 11, 1942, near the New Hebrides, Vanuatu, despite the Soviet Union's neutrality with Japan at the time, an action reflecting the Imperial Japanese Navy's aggressive stance towards a suspected Allied aligned shipping. The Imperial Japanese Navy had some well-detailed maps of Australia to work with, such as these. That's a 1943 map, I think. Some of the maps were more accurate than others. That's Melbourne. Yeah. There's Americans here. But for the moment, we'll focus on this one. 2 days before I-21 made a similar flight, I-25 completed a reconnaissance over Sydney Harbour on February 17, 1942. Then I-25 proceeded south, and on February 25, 1942, the submarine surfaced 10 miles north of Cape Wickham on King Island in Bass Strait, approximately 240 kilometres or 150 miles from Melbourne. Pilot Officer Nobuo Fujita and his observer Soji Okuda took off 2 hours before dawn, with the plane catapulted into the air from the deck around 3 a.m. north toward Melbourne at low altitude to avoid detection. Crossing Bass Strait, Fujita headed for Cape Otway, where he banked to the northeast and followed the coastline to the Point Lonsdale lighthouse near the entrance to Port Phillip. Fujita struck a few heavy banks of cloud as they flew across the Bellarine Peninsula towards Port Arlington, with the city of Geelong about 16 kilometres away to the left. The Glen eventually broke out of the cloud cover directly over the RAAF's Laverton airfield. There were about 12 Wirraways at Laverton, along with some Lockheed Hudsons and Avro Ansons, and 9 RAF personnel at Laverton reported sighting the Japanese aircraft. Some accounts claim 2 aircraft were scrambled to try to locate the float plane, but found nothing. Fujita climbed back into the relative safety of the clouds and headed for Melbourne. He passed over Altona. He used a tactic of dropping down out of the clouds every now and then to make some observations and then climbing back up into the clouds for safety. The city was trialling wartime blackout conditions, making the early morning observations more challenging. The anti-aircraft gunners at Williamstown allegedly spotted the aircraft, but permissions to fire were delayed, because again they needed those permissions to fire, allowing the plane to complete its mission unmolested by air defences. They continued southwards over St Kilda, Brighton and Sandringham, and then turned towards Frankston. Okuda, with the canopy back, spotted 19 vessels anchored in the harbour through his binoculars. He also spotted 6 warships headed in single file towards the Port Melbourne dock area. Fujita confirmed through his binoculars that the leading ship was a light cruiser and the others were all destroyers. Fujita noted the red, green and yellow roof tiles on all the houses and the beautiful countryside and large flocks of sheep. Lasting about 4 hours and covering a round trip of about 600 kilometres, they returned to the I-25, landing on the sea surface close to where they expected the submarine to be. I want to think about this for a moment. They took off in the dark from a submarine in an active area, at an active sea, in the dark. The submarine most likely submerged for part of their flight. They surfaced, the surfaced I-25 had drifted 6 miles east of Cape Wickham Lighthouse. Fujita and Ikuda had to take the weather conditions, the tidal drift and the time frame. They did so effectively that they landed in sight of the recently surfaced submarine. It's worth noting if the mission had been conducted a few months later, they would have been detected by a radar station that was installed at Cape Otway in June. Tagami set a course down the west coast of Tasmania, travelling on the surface, and settled around in Great Oyster Bay there, about halfway up Tasmania's east coast. On March 1, 1942, Fujita launched from the water under a full moon. The aircraft flew up the Derwent River and over Hobart, observing the city and its surroundings, including Mount Wellington. The crew noted 5 cargo ships at anchor, but no warships, as well as the glow of a foundry furnace and a white concrete road. I-25 submerged after the float plane's wingtip was damaged while being hoisted back on board. The Hobart flight revealed a relatively undefended port with no significant naval presence, which may have influenced Japanese perceptions of Tasmania as a lower priority target compared to ports like Sydney. These operations demonstrated the reach of Japanese naval forces and heightened Australia's sense of vulnerability, prompting improvements in coastal defences and air raid precautions in both Victoria and Tasmania. I-25 then sailed east to make reconnaissance flights over Wellington and New Zealand on March 1942, and then Auckland about 4 days later. Petty Officer Soji Ikuda, who's the gentleman in white sitting on the wing, that's the only photograph that we know of him that I've certainly been able to find. Served as the observer of the I-25, playing a critical supporting role in all the previously mentioned operations, identifying and documenting key details about shipping movements, harbour defences, potential targets. Ikuda fades from the historical record after these early wartime operations. There is no widely available information about his personal background, such as his birth date or early life. He remains a footnote in the story of Japan's wartime aviation efforts, defined primarily by his partnership with Pilot Officer Fujita, who stated in his 1961 testimonial that Ikuda did not survive the war. That's it. Warrant Flying Officer Nobuo Fujita, let's see there, born in 1911 on a farm in central Japan, has much more information available about him, but that will probably make sense in a moment. Fujita, standing barely 5 feet tall, was conscripted into the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1931 after a boot camp. He went to air school at, I'm going to attempt to say it, Kasumgarai. In the mid-1930s, he tested experimental seaplanes, and in 1937 served 6 months in China flying rescue missions along the Yangtze River. He returned to Japan the following year as a flight instructor, joining the Submarine Aviation Unit in 1941. Before deploying, his father entrusted him with the family's precious centuries-old sword, which was somewhat traditional. Fujita was on board I-25 during the attack on Pearl Harbor, where I-25 and 3 other submarines patrolled the line north of Oahu. Fujita's plane did not function properly and was unable to participate in the reconnaissance mission planned before the attack. Fujita himself suggested the idea of submarine-based seaplane to bomb military targets, including ships at sea and attacks on the US mainland, especially the strategic Panama Canal. The idea was approved and the mission was given to I-25. Submarine aircraft carriers such as the giant I-400 class submarines would be developed specifically to bomb the Panama Canal. I-25 operated in the South Pacific later in 1942, supporting Japan's campaign in the Solomon Islands. But on August 31st, 1942, off Guadalcanal, its Glen float plane spotted the US aircraft carrier USS Saratoga, though no successful attack followed. Fujita was looking forward to seeing his wife and young son when I-25 returned to Japan in mid-July 1942. However, as soon as he landed, word came that he was to report immediately to Naval Headquarters. So to have a break. In his own post-war written statement, he wondered if he was going to be called on the carpet for some infraction. Instead, as he entered an inner office, he was stunned to see Prince Takamatsu, Emperor Hirohito's younger brother. Another officer began the meeting. Fujita, you are going to bomb the American mainland. Asaku Okamoto, a former vice consul for Seattle and an expert on the Pacific Northwest and its histories of wildfires, pointed to a map of Oregon and said, "You will bomb these forests. Once a fire gets started in the deep woods, it's very difficult to stop. Sometimes whole towns are burned." He had in mind a September 1936 conflagration that destroyed 287,000 acres of Oregon forest and wiped out the coastal town of Bandon, killing 11 people. It doesn't seem like a big town. Aside from grabbing Americans' attention and causing panic, the best case scenario for the plan would be to force the US to divert naval resources, then concentrated in the Solomon Islands to the west coast. I-25's most famous mission occurred at 6 a.m. on 9th of September. I-25 surfaced west off the Oregon-California border, where she launched the Glen with 154 kilograms load of 2 incendiary bombs. Fujita dropped 2 bombs, one on Wheeler Ridge on Mount Emily in Oregon. The location of the other bomb is unclear. Still, the Wheeler Ridge bomb started a small fire 16 kilometres due east of Brookings, which US Forest Service employees were able to extinguish. Approximately 27 kilograms of fragments, including the nose of the bomb, were turned over to the United States Army. After the bombing, I-25 came under attack by US AAF aircraft on patrol, forcing the submarine to dive and hide in the ocean floor off Port Orford. The American attacks caused only minor damage, and Fujita flew a second bombing sortie 3 weeks later, on September 29, dropping bombs east of Port Orford in Oregon. This attack also failed to cause significant fires due to weather conditions and prompt firefighting. The 2 attacks on Oregon in September 1942 were the only enemy aircraft bombings on the contiguous United States, and were the second time the continental United States was attacked by such aircraft during World War II, following the bombing of Dutch Harbour in Unalaska, Alaska 3 months earlier. Continuing to patrol the US coastline before heading home for Japan, I-25 attacked SS Camden on 4 October 1942. The Camden took 6 days to succumb to the damage before sinking. On October 5, I-25 sank SS Larry Doheny, sinking here 8 miles off Gold Beach, Oregon. The day after the Camden finally sank, I-25 torpedoed and sank the Soviet submarine L-16, mistaking it for an American vessel. This action on October 11, 1942 was the last reported sinking by I-25 before returning to Japan. I-25's operational career ended in 1943. In August, while patrolling near the New Hebrides, it was detected and sunk by the US destroyer USS Patterson off the coast of Espiritu Santo. The submarine was depth charged and destroyed with all hands lost, totaling approximately 94 crew members. Its wreck has not been definitively located. Fujita continued as an Imperial Japanese Navy pilot, mainly in reconnaissance duties, and was promoted to the rank of ensign. In 1943, he was transferred to the Kashima Naval Air Corps, a seaplane training and later a mainland air defence unit, where he served as an instructor attached to the aviation squadron. In February 1945, while flying a Mitsubishi F-1M reconnaissance float plane, Fujita was involved in an interception and unconfirmed downing of an American Grumman F-6F Hellcat. Just before the end of the war, Fujita volunteered to join the Kamikaze Special Attack Force. and he was transferred to the Kawa Naval Air Corps, where he trained kamikaze pilots and prepared to take part in an attack himself. Kawanashi N1K Kyofu float planes were used for the training, but because of multiple factors including poor visibility and the difficulty for crew members with little flight experience to take off and land on water, Fujita did not perform any missions before the war's end. Before his demobilisation, he was promoted to sub-lieutenant, and after the war he opened a hardware store and later worked at a company making wire. Fujita's story took a remarkable turn toward reconciliation. He was invited to Brookings in Oregon in 1962 by the local JCs. He agreed to go after the Japanese government was assured he would not be tried as a war criminal. He arrived carrying his family's 400-year-old samurai sword, the cherished heirloom he'd taken on his missions. Fearing hostility, he was prepared to commit seppuku if met with rejection. But instead he was warmly welcomed, and as a gesture of peace, he gifted the sword to the city. Over the years, Fujita deepened his bond with Brookings, promising a trip for local high school students to visit Japan, and despite the bankruptcy of his own company, he made good on his promise by co-sponsoring the visit of 3 female students from Brookings Harbour High School to Japan. During the students' visit, Fujita received a US flag that had flown over the US Capitol building and a dedicated letter from an aide of President Ronald Reagan with admiration for your kindness and generosity. Both are now on display at the Fujita corner of the Japan Ground Self-Defense Forces camp at Kasamogo-ra Public Relations Centre, that's a mouthful. Fujita returned to Brookings in 1990, 1992 and 1995, and in 1992 he planted a tree at the bomb site as a gesture of peace, and in 1945 he moved the samurai sword from the Brookings City Hall into the new library's display case. And he also helped to gather money to build the library. Just days before his death in 1997, at the age of 85 from lung cancer, he was made an honorary citizen of Brookings. His daughter later buried some of his ashes at the bomb site, symbolising his lasting connection to the place he once attacked. Fujita's journey from a wartime pilot to a symbol of peace highlights a unique chapter of reconciliation between former enemies. His actions during and after the war reflect both the conflict of his era and his personal efforts to mend its wounds. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. That was excellent, very insightful. We're going to hold questions until after the next session.